Throughout the centuries, the papacy has been seen as the spiritual pinnacle of leadership for over 1 billion Catholics worldwide, the successor of St. Peter himself, the visible sign of unity for the Church. Yet history, in its brutal honesty, also reveals that the office of the Pope has not always been filled by saints. In fact, there were moments so dark, so riddled with corruption, greed, violence, and unspeakable immorality. Among the earliest and most grotesque scandals in papal history was the infamous reign of Pope Stephen VI, whose actions plunged the papacy into a nightmare that still shocks historians today. His tenure, beginning in 896 AD, was short but filled with madness. Driven by a vicious personal grudge and the chaotic politics of a collapsing Rome, Stephen committed one of the most morbid acts in church history, the Cadaver Synod. Obsessed with condemning his predecessor, Pope Formosus, Stephen had Formosus's corpse exhumed from its tomb, clothed in papal vestments, and propped up in a public trial. The rotting, grotesque body was formally accused of crimes, cross-examined, and found guilty by Stephen himself, a spectacle that horrified even the brutal society of the 9th century. As onlookers watched in sickened awe, Stephen screamed curses at the corpse, and once the farcical trial ended, had the body stripped of its sacred robes, mutilated, and thrown into the Tiber River like trash. The Cadaver Synod was not merely a grotesque stunt. It was a catastrophic scandal that shattered what little spiritual authority the papacy still held at that time. Faithful Catholics were appalled and confused. What was supposed to be the sacred seat of Peter now seemed like the stage for a lunatic theater of hate and revenge. Rome, already suffering from violence and political decay, plunged into near anarchy. Stephen's actions exposed the depths to which papal ambition had sunk. The office had become a weapon for vendettas, not a ministry for souls. Ironically, Stephen's reign ended almost as brutally as his victims. Outraged mobs, fed up with the desecration of sacred tradition, imprisoned him, and he was strangled to death in his cell, a grim reflection of the chaos he had unleashed. The nightmare of the Cadaver Synod left a permanent scar on the history of the papacy, a chilling reminder that when hatred and personal ambition infect the heart of leadership, no title, not even that of Pope, can shield a man from the judgment of history or of God. If the reign of Pope Stephen VI revealed how personal vengeance could rot the heart of the papacy, the reign of Pope John XII showed the world how absolute power, placed into the hands of an unprepared and morally bankrupt youth, could turn the sacred throne of Peter into a den of debauchery. John XII ascended to the papacy in 955 AD at around 18 years of age, a boy thrust into the role not because of spiritual merit, but because of the ruthless ambitions of his noble family, the powerful Crescentii dynasty of Rome. Almost immediately, John treated the papacy not as a spiritual stewardship, but as his personal playground. Contemporary accounts describe his court as a brothel rather than a holy see, filled with drunken feasts, gambling, and open fornication, not hidden shamefully, but paraded shamelessly within the Lateran palace itself. Priests and bishops were appointed or dismissed based on bribes or personal favor, sacred offices reduced to tokens in the Pope's games of greed and lust. The crimes attributed to John XII are so numerous and grotesque that some historians have wondered if even the worst rumors barely scratched the surface. He is said to have ordained a deacon in a stable, mocked holy rites, and invoked pagan gods while presiding over church ceremonies. Adultery, incest, and even murder were whispered among the scandals tied to his name. His papacy so scandalized Christendom that secular rulers, normally deferential to the Pope's authority, intervened. In 963, Holy Roman Emperor Otto I convened a council that formally deposed John, citing an avalanche of evidence for his unworthiness. Yet even in disgrace, John's fall was not immediate. He fled, rallied mercenaries, and returned briefly to Rome in a final desperate bid for power, only to meet a fitting end. He died not in battle or prayer, but reportedly of a stroke while committing adultery. His death was seen by many contemporaries as divine judgment, and his legacy remains a dark stain on the history of the papacy. John XII serves as a brutal reminder that youth, wealth, and title cannot sanctify a soul. Only a heart surrendered to God can, and his heart had long abandoned the sacred for the sordid. Among all the notorious figures in papal history, few names provoke as much immediate revulsion and fascination as Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia. Rising to power during the late 15th century, a time already steeped in political corruption and ruthless ambition, Alexander VI embodied every vice the Renaissance Church is infamous for. Elected in 1492 after shamelessly bribing the College of Cardinals with money, promises of offices and favors, Rodrigo Borgia turned the sacred office of the Pope into a personal empire of greed, nepotism, and vice. His pontificate was not focused on shepherding souls, but on consolidating power for his illegitimate children, enriching his family dynasty, and turning Rome into a cesspool of political intrigue and personal indulgence. The Vatican became less a house of prayer and more a royal court filled with masked balls, extravagant banquets, and secret deals brokered in dark corridors. Alexander VI openly acknowledged his many children, appointing them to high-ranking positions within the Church and arranging political marriages that served his worldly ambitions. His most infamous offspring, Cesare Borgia and Lucrezia Borgia, were themselves symbols of treachery and scandal, rumored to be involved in conspiracies, poisonings, and political assassinations. Under Alexander's rule, the papal treasury was drained to fund lavish personal entertainments and military campaigns aimed at expanding Borgia influence across Italy. It was during his reign that the moral authority of the papacy sank to depths so catastrophic that it helped ignite the Protestant Reformation within decades. While many contemporaries were corrupted by the times, Alexander's crimes were so open, so egregious, that even his defenders could hardly justify them. His death, fittingly, was surrounded by whispers of irony, poisoned by a scheme that may have been intended for someone else. The Borgia Pope left behind a Rome stripped of dignity, a church gasping for reform, and a memory so stained with infamy that his name still evokes images of absolute shameless corruption. In Alexander VI, history finds the terrifying portrait of what happens when the spiritual heart of the Church is surrendered entirely to the greed and appetites of the flesh. When the Church most desperately needed healing and unity, the election of Pope Urban VI in 1378 brought instead a reign of terror and division that would fracture Christianity for generations. Initially elected in the hopes of reforming the corrupt practices of the Avignon papacy, Urban quickly revealed a temperament so violent, paranoid, and cruel that even his closest allies recoiled in horror. Almost immediately after his election, he alienated the cardinals who had supported him by lashing out with uncontrollable rage, humiliating bishops publicly, and threatening executions for even minor dissent. His behavior was so erratic and abusive that a majority of the cardinals fled Rome, declared his election invalid, and chose a rival pope, Clement VII, plunging the Church into the nightmare of the Western Schism, a division that would last for nearly 40 years and devastate the spiritual unity of Christendom. Urban VI responded to dissent not with pastoral concern, but with iron-fisted brutality. He imprisoned cardinals, tortured priests, and ordered executions to maintain his grip on power. His rage knew no boundaries. Even among his own court, fear reigned supreme, with clergy and advisors terrified of slighting him accidentally and paying with their lives. His abuses fueled political wars across Europe as kingdoms were forced to choose sides between rival claimants to the papacy, causing bloodshed, confusion, and a crisis of faith that left deep scars on the Church's credibility. Even after his death, the schism he sparked endured, with anti-popes reigning in Avignon and Rome, both claiming legitimacy, while ordinary Christians were left to wonder whom to trust and whether the very foundations of their faith had been corrupted beyond repair. Pope Urban VI serves as a brutal warning from history that when pride, wrath, and paranoia enter the heart of a spiritual leader, even the highest office in Christendom can become an instrument of destruction rather than healing. Among all the dark chapters in the long history of the papacy, few are as jaw-droppingly scandalous as the life of Pope Benedict IX, a man who treated the highest spiritual office not as a sacred trust, but as a toy to be bought, sold, and traded for personal pleasure. Born into the powerful Tusculani family, Benedict IX was thrust into the papacy as a teenager in 1032, not because of his holiness, but because of his family's ruthless political clout. From the very beginning, his reign was a disgrace. Contemporary chroniclers described him as violent, immoral, and thoroughly unfit for the sacred duties entrusted to him. The Liber Pontificalis, a record of papal histories, bluntly stated that Benedict IX lived a life of rapes, murders, and other unspeakable acts, horrifying even in an era not unaccustomed to scandal among rulers. But what truly immortalized Benedict IX in the annals of infamy was his shocking decision to sell the papacy itself. Tired of the responsibilities of the office, or perhaps eager to marry for love or lust, Benedict agreed to abdicate, but only for a price. He literally sold the papal title to his godfather, John Gratian, who became Pope Gregory VI after paying a hefty sum. Never before and never again would the papacy be reduced to such brazen commercial transaction. The corruption surrounding the sale plunged Rome into chaos, undermined the credibility of the Church across Europe, and forced Emperor Henry III to intervene militarily to restore order. Benedict's abdication was not even final. He would later attempt to reclaim the papacy by force, plunging the Vatican into a period of deep scandal and confusion. His life stands as perhaps the most disgraceful personal betrayal of the office of St. Peter, a grotesque mockery of the very notion that the Pope is the servant of the servants of God. In Benedict IX, the papacy reached one of its absolute lowest points, a terrifying reminder of what happens when sacred trust is corrupted by unchecked personal ambition and moral collapse. While the name Pope Sixtus IV often conjures images of the magnificent Sistine Chapel, it hides a far darker and more disturbing legacy beneath the brushstrokes of Renaissance beauty. Elected Pope in 1471, Sixtus IV's reign became synonymous with the ruthless use of ecclesiastical power for political gain, financial corruption, and bloody intrigue. His papacy marked the height of nepotism in the Church, where sacred offices were handed out like currency to relatives, allies, and the highest bidders, utterly poisoning the credibility of the Church's hierarchy. Sixtus IV was relentless in advancing the fortunes of his family, the Della Rovere clan, installing nephews as cardinals and bestowing upon them immense wealth and political authority, often at the expense of genuine spiritual leadership. Under his rule, simony, the buying and selling of church offices, reached new and scandalous heights, turning what should have been a calling into little more than a commercial transaction. Yet Sixtus IV's corruption went beyond greed. He was directly implicated in one of the most infamous crimes of Renaissance Italy, the Papacy conspiracy. In a plot designed to increase papal control over Florence, Sixtus supported an attempt to assassinate Lorenzo de' Medici and his brother Giuliano during Easter Mass inside the Florence Cathedral. Although Lorenzo survived, Giuliano was brutally murdered at the altar, and blood was spilled on holy ground, all with the blessing, if not the direct orchestration, of the Vicar of Christ. When the plot failed, Sixtus excommunicated the entire city of Florence and waged a brutal war against it, justifying bloodshed under the thin veil of papal authority. The scandal of his papacy would contribute to the growing disgust that fueled calls for reform, culminating decades later in the Protestant Reformation. Sixtus IV turned the Vatican into a palace of worldly ambition, and his reign stands as a brutal reminder that even the greatest works of art can be built atop corruption, cruelty, and betrayal. While many popes who lived during the medieval era wielded immense political power, Pope Innocent III stands out as one of the most ruthless and terrifying examples of how spiritual authority could be weaponized for domination. Elected in 1198, Innocent III is often praised by some historians for asserting papal supremacy over kings and emperors, but the methods by which he expanded that power left a dark, blood-soaked trail across Europe. Under his leadership, the Church did not merely advise secular rulers, it commanded armies, waged wars, and unleashed brutal campaigns against anyone who dared question papal authority. The most chilling example of this was the Albigensian Crusade, a war launched against the Cathar heretics of southern France. Innocent III preached the crusade with the same fervor once reserved for wars against Muslim forces in the Holy Land, but this time the targets were European Christians, men, women, and children. The Albigensian Crusade was marked by atrocities so horrific that they shocked even the hardened warriors of the medieval age. Entire towns were burned to the ground, civilians massacred without distinction. When asked how to differentiate heretics from faithful Catholics during the sack of Béziers, the papal legate famously replied, "Kill them all, God will know his own." Under Innocent's blessing, Europe witnessed one of the bloodiest religious purges in its history, leaving tens of thousands dead and entire regions devastated. Beyond the Crusades, Innocent III also institutionalized systems of control over marriage, taxation, and governance that expanded the Church's reach deep into the personal lives of the faithful, often crushing local customs and independence under the weight of papal law. While some praise him for strengthening the administrative structures of the Church, his legacy remains stained by the rivers of blood spilled under his command. Pope Innocent III's reign reveals a terrifying truth, that even spiritual zeal, when mixed with political ambition and self-righteousness, can unleash horrors rivaling any in secular history. When Pope Leo VI ascended to the papacy in 1513, it was supposed to herald the triumph of the Renaissance within the Church, a golden era of art, learning, and religious renewal. Instead, Leo VI's reign became the final act of decay that would detonate the unity of Christendom forever. A member of the powerful Medici family, Leo treated the papacy not as a spiritual commission, but as the most luxurious prize of a political dynasty. His court in Rome rivaled that of any earthly king, drowning in extravagance, opulence, and hedonistic pleasures. The treasury of the Church, already depleted by years of mismanagement, hemorrhaged further under Leo's rule as he poured fortunes into lavish feasts, elaborate spectacles, and personal projects, most famously the construction of St. Peter's Basilica. But it was the method he used to fund his excesses that would ignite a revolution, the aggressive selling of indulgences. Indulgences, certificates promising the remission of punishment for sins, had long existed within church practice, but under Leo VI, they became a full-blown commercial enterprise. Agents were dispatched across Europe, hawking salvation as though it were a common marketplace good. Pitches promised not just forgiveness for the living, but the liberation of souls suffering in purgatory. The notorious slogan of one indulgence preacher captured the grotesque spirit of the campaign. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. Ordinary Christians, desperate to secure mercy for themselves and their loved ones, emptied their pockets into the papal coffers. The exploitation was so blatant, so vile, that it triggered outrage among scholars, priests, and eventually a young German monk named Martin Luther. Luther's 95 Theses were nailed to a church door in 1517, launching the Protestant Reformation, a cataclysm that would shatter the unity of the Catholic Church, divide Europe for centuries, and unleash wars that would cost millions of lives. Leo X reportedly dismissed Luther at first, allegedly sneering, "He is a drunken German. He will change his mind when he sobers up." But it was Leo's own spiritual drunkenness on power and wealth that would leave the Church in ruins. His reign stands as one of history's most sobering lessons, that when salvation itself becomes a commodity, faith collapses under the weight of betrayal. Few popes in history embodied arrogance, brutality, and spiritual abuse as fully as Pope Boniface VIII. Elected in 1294 after manipulating the resignation of his holy but overwhelmed predecessor, Boniface wasted no time turning the papacy into a throne of raw power and political oppression. He proclaimed without shame that salvation itself was impossible without submission to the Pope. Not to Christ first, but to himself. His infamous papal bull, Unam Sanctum, declared that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff, elevating papal authority above kings, emperors, and even common conscience. Boniface's rule was not pastoral, but imperial. He treated dissent as treason and wielded excommunication like a sword against any ruler who challenged him. His bitter conflict with King Philip IV of France escalated into open warfare, with Boniface seeking to tax clergy for his own financial ambitions while condemning secular authorities who dared resist. When Philip finally moved against him, agents stormed Boniface's palace at Anagni, humiliating the aging pope and beating him savagely. Though he was briefly rescued, the humiliation broke him, and he died shortly after, bitter, disgraced, and raging against the world. Even Dante, in his Divine Comedy, placed Boniface VIII in the eighth circle of hell, reserved for those guilty of simony and religious corruption. Boniface VIII's reign left a spiritual wasteland in its wake, convincing many that the papacy had become a bloated relic of ambition rather than a beacon of holiness. His legacy is a brutal warning. When pride infects the soul, even the seat of St. Peter can be turned into a throne of ruin. At one of the most critical moments in Christian history, when unity could have been preserved and disaster averted, Pope Clement VII stood as a tragic symbol of cowardice, betrayal, and political blundering. Elected in 1523 during the furious storms of the Protestant Reformation, Clement VII faced a Europe teetering on the brink of religious collapse. Instead of rising to meet the spiritual emergency, he sank deeper into petty politics, scheming alliances, and personal self-preservation. Terrified of losing influence, Clement wavered endlessly between the mighty forces of Emperor Charles V and the King of France, alienating both and provoking a catastrophe that would forever stain his name: the sack of Rome in 1527. Betrayed by his own political miscalculations, Clement watched helplessly as mercenary armies, many of them nominally Christian, descended upon Rome, pillaging churches, raping nuns, murdering priests, and turning the Eternal City into a smoldering graveyard of broken faith. For 8 months, Rome lay devastated while Clement cowered inside Castel Sant'Angelo, hiding behind its thick walls, offering little leadership, little comfort, and even less courage. The symbolic heart of Christendom lay in ruins, its relics desecrated, its sacred treasures plundered, and much of the blame pointed directly at the Pope, who had chosen political vanity over spiritual vigilance. Clement's indecision not only weakened the Catholic Church's influence for centuries, but also emboldened Protestant reformers, convinced that the papacy had become a rotting corpse, unworthy of obedience. His reign represents one of the most shameful betrayals of the Church's divine mission, a time when fear, vanity, and the lust for worldly survival outweighed fidelity to the gospel. In the ruins of Rome, history carved Clement VII's tragic epitaph, a warning to every leader who chooses compromise over conviction and fear over faith.